Right, well, this is going to upset some people.
But I think Scott Peterson is innocent.
There is no new evidence.
Scott Peterson is innocent.
You have no idea where this is. None.
This morning, an exclusive look at A&E's new documentary that examines alternative theories and evidence in the notorious case of Scott Peterson, who is currently serving a life sentence without parole for the 2004 murders of his wife Laci and their unborn child Connor.
There is new science that suggests that Scott Peterson is innocent.
23 years after Laci Peterson vanished on Christmas Eve, and more than 2 decades after a jury sent her husband to prison for her murder and the murder of their unborn son, new evidence has surfaced that his own defense team says could unravel the case entirely. A burned-out van, a burglary across the street from the Peterson home, a piece of forensic testing that, according to one investigator, quietly came back positive for human DNA years after the case was already closed in the public's mind. None of this proves Scott Peterson is innocent, but it does raise a question that has followed this case since the very beginning. Did investigators get this conviction right, or did they build an entire case around the first theory that made sense and stop looking the moment it did? By the end of this video, you will understand exactly what this new evidence claims to show, why prosecutors say it does not change anything at all, and why this decades-old case is suddenly back in the national conversation. Before we go further, if you are new here, this channel breaks down real documented cases using real sources, no speculation dressed up as fact. Subscribe to True Crime Revealed so you do not miss where this case goes next, because what this new evidence actually reveals may not be what you expect. Let us start with what actually happened, because to understand why this new evidence matters, you need to understand exactly how thin the original case truly was. On December 24, 2002, Laci Peterson, 27 years old and 8 months pregnant with a son she and her husband had already named Connor, disappeared from her home in Modesto, California. Her husband, Scott Peterson, said he had left that morning to go fishing alone at the Berkeley Marina, roughly 90 miles away. When he returned home that evening, he said his wife was gone. Her disappearance triggered one of the largest missing persons searches in California history, and within days, national media had turned Modesto into the center of the country's attention. What followed was months of search efforts, mounting public suspicion directed almost entirely at Scott Peterson, and the revelation that he had been having an affair with a woman named Amber Frey, a relationship he had not disclosed to investigators or, for a period, even to Frey herself, who did not know he was married. That affair became central to the prosecution's case, not as physical evidence connecting him to the crime, but as a motive, a reason for a husband to want his pregnant wife gone. In April of 2003, the remains of Laci and her unborn son washed ashore separately along the San Francisco Bay, not far from the marina where Scott said he had been fishing that same day months earlier. Scott Peterson was arrested shortly afterward, charged with 2 counts of murder, and in 2004, a jury in San Mateo County, after the trial had been moved out of Stanislaus County due to the intensity of local publicity, found him guilty on both counts. He was sentenced to death. It is worth pausing here to say plainly what the prosecution's case actually consisted of, because this detail matters enormously for what comes later. There was no confession. There was no eyewitness who saw Scott Peterson harm his wife. There was no direct physical or forensic evidence tying him to her death. The case against him was, by design and by necessity, entirely circumstantial, built from the affair, from inconsistencies in his statements, from behavior that struck investigators and later a jury as suspicious, and from the location where the remains were found relative to where he said he had been that day. Circumstantial cases are not inherently weak. Many circumstantial cases result in accurate, well-earned convictions. But a case built entirely on circumstance is also a case where the absence of alternative leads becomes just as important as the evidence actually presented. Because if investigators stopped looking for other explanations too early, an entirely different narrative could have gone uninvestigated. That is exactly what Scott Peterson's current legal team argues happened. In 2020, the California Supreme Court overturned his death sentence, citing juror misconduct concerns during jury selection. He was resentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Around that same period, the Los Angeles Innocence Project took up his case, a nonprofit organization that provides legal representation to people who maintain they were wrongly convicted. Since then, his legal team has filed repeated petitions asking courts to re-examine the case, arguing that new evidence undermines the prosecution's entire theory. As recently as April of this year, a San Mateo County Superior Court judge denied his most recent bid to overturn the conviction. The Los Angeles Innocence Project has said it plans to appeal that ruling to a higher court. That appeal, as of this update, remains ongoing. Now let us walk through what this new evidence actually is, because the details matter far more than the headline claims surrounding them. The first and most significant piece involves a burglary. According to Scott Peterson's defense team, a burglary was reported at a home directly across the street from the Peterson residence, belonging to neighbors named Rudy and Susan Medina. 2 men were eventually arrested in connection with that burglary and pleaded guilty. The defense theory built around this burglary is straightforward in its logic, even if it remains entirely unproven. Investigators originally stated that this burglary occurred on December 26th, 2 days after Laci disappeared. If that is accurate, the burglary has essentially nothing to do with her case at all, but Scott Peterson's legal team now claims to have evidence showing the burglary actually occurred the same morning Laci vanished, meaning it happened after Scott had already left for his fishing trip. If that timeline is correct, the defense argues, Laci could have witnessed or interrupted the burglary in progress and been abducted and killed by the burglars themselves rather than by her husband. It is critical to be precise about what has actually been established here and what has not. This is a defense theory, presented by Scott Peterson's own legal team, and it directly contradicts the timeline previously established by investigators and accepted by the jury that convicted him. Prosecutors have publicly pushed back on this exact claim, stating that the burglary occurred after the murder, not before or during it. One detail cited in support of the original timeline is worth noting. Journalists who were present covering Laci's disappearance said the neighborhood was already saturated with media by December 26th and questioned whether a burglary could realistically have occurred unnoticed with that much press activity already on the street. That is a meaningful piece of context that cuts against the defense's revised timeline, and it deserves to be weighed alongside the new claims rather than ignored in favor of the more dramatic version of events. The second major piece of new evidence involves a van. According to reporting on this case, a stolen vehicle connected to the burglary was later found burned and abandoned in the airport district of Modesto, roughly a mile from the Peterson home. Inside that van, investigators reportedly found a mattress, which was collected as evidence and tested at the time. According to a former fire investigator who responded to the scene the day after Laci's disappearance, that mattress initially came back with a presumptive positive result that was later determined negative for human blood when tested by the Department of Justice. That same investigator has said that years later, he discovered the sample had actually tested positive for human DNA, information he says he had no knowledge of until recently. He has described that discovery in stark terms, saying he was genuinely shocked to learn it, and that the realization affected him physically once he understood what it could mean for the broader case. This claim deserves careful handling because it is a serious allegation about mishandled or miscommunicated forensic evidence, but it currently rests on the account of one individual, a former investigator now working privately, rather than something independently confirmed through public court documents at this stage. If accurate, it would represent a significant failure in how physical evidence connected to a nearby burglary was tracked and communicated during the original investigation. If it is incomplete or missing context that has not yet been made public, it would not carry the same weight the defense is currently placing on it. Either way, this claim is a central reason the defense sought expanded DNA testing on evidence collected during the original investigation. That leads to the third major thread, the fight over retesting. Peterson's legal team requested new DNA testing on more than a dozen pieces of evidence from the original investigation, including material connected to that van and its mattress. A judge presiding over the case ultimately approved new testing on only a single item, a piece of duct tape that had been found on Laci's pants when her remains were recovered. That ruling represents a significant limitation on how far this new evidence push has actually been allowed to go through the court system itself. The defense wanted a broad forensic re-examination. What they were granted was narrow, a single piece of tape, tested using DNA technology far more advanced than what was available in 2002. The fourth thread involves an allegation that evidence connected to the burglary itself was destroyed while Peterson's case was still active, and in some accounts, shortly after his arrest. According to individuals interviewed for the recent documentary covering this case, including a former defense attorney and a retired Los Angeles Police Department detective who worked on reviewing the case, original interviews with the men connected to the burglary, along with other related evidence, were not preserved. One investigator featured in the documentary offered a blunt explanation for why she believes that happened, stating her belief that authorities dismissed the burglary because they felt they already understood what had happened to Laci and did not see a reason to preserve evidence connected to a lead they considered irrelevant. That is a pointed criticism of investigative tunnel vision. The idea that once a theory feels settled, evidence that does not fit that theory stops being treated as worth protecting. It is an allegation, not a proven fact, but it is the kind of claim that, if substantiated, would represent a serious institutional failure, regardless of whether it ultimately changes the outcome of Peterson's guilt or innocence. The fifth thread is perhaps the most unusual, an alleged second-hand account from inside the prison system itself. According to Peterson's sister-in-law, Janie Peterson, who has spent years building her own independent file on this case, a corrections lieutenant contacted the Modesto Police Department to relay a claim from an inmate. That inmate reportedly said he had overheard another inmate discussing the burglary, specifically describing that Laci had confronted the men involved at the Medina home. This account is several layers removed from direct evidence, an inmate reporting what another inmate allegedly said, relayed through a corrections official, and repeated years later by a family member advocating for Peterson's release. It should be treated with the caution that distance from the original source demands. It is included here because it is part of the public record surrounding this new evidence push, not because it should be weighed the same as forensic testing or documented timelines. Taken together, these threads form the backbone of a two-part documentary that aired this week, titled Scott Peterson, The New Evidence, produced by A&E. The documentary features Peterson's former defense attorney, alongside a retired Los Angeles Police Department detective and additional legal analysts, walking through this case more than 2 decades after the conviction. According to descriptions of the documentary, it also includes new scientific analysis involving fetal biometric studies and tidal data, methods aimed at re-examining questions about where and when the remains entered the water, questions that were central to the original prosecution's timeline, linking Peterson's fishing trip location to where the bodies were eventually found. Now, it is essential to give equal weight to the other side of this, because a case does not become uncertain simply because a documentary and a legal team say it should be. The Stanislaus County District Attorney's Office has responded directly and firmly to this renewed push. In a public statement, the office said Peterson's 2004 conviction has been upheld through 2 decades of post-conviction litigation, and was upheld again with the April ruling denying his latest bid for relief. The statement specifically said that Laci, Connor, and their family deserve the finality that justice promised them. That is a direct, on-the-record rejection of the idea that this new evidence changes anything about the fundamental soundness of the original conviction. Prosecutors are not required to relitigate a case in the court of public opinion every time a documentary revisits it, and their position deserves to be represented here with the same clarity as the defense's claims. It is also worth remembering that this is not the first time new evidence has been claimed in this case. Petitions citing new evidence have been filed multiple times over the past several years, and previous attempts to introduce additional witness testimony have already been rejected by courts reviewing this case. This pattern matters, not because it means the current claims are automatically wrong, but because it shows a long-running, ongoing legal effort that has, up to this point, not succeeded in overturning the underlying conviction, regardless of how each new round of claims has been described publicly at the time it surfaced. So where does that leave us? Scott Peterson remains a convicted murderer, serving a sentence of life without parole, and that conviction has survived every legal challenge brought against it over more than 20 years, including the challenge decided just months ago. At the same time, his legal team has now assembled a specific, documented set of claims, a disputed burglary timeline, a van with forensic history that one investigator says was misrepresented for years, destroyed evidence tied to a lead investigators may have dismissed too quickly, and a narrow but real court-ordered DNA retest now underway on a single piece of physical evidence. None of these claims, even taken together, currently amount to legal proof of innocence, but they do amount to a serious, if still unresolved, argument that the original investigation may not have looked as hard at alternative explanations as it should have, once investigators settled on Scott Peterson as their primary and, ultimately, only suspect. That tension between a conviction repeatedly upheld by courts and a defense team that says the physical evidence tells a different story than the one presented at trial is exactly why this case refuses to fade from public conversation more than 2 decades later. It is also why the outcome of the current DNA retesting on that single piece of duct tape carries more weight than its size would suggest. A result that reinforces the original conviction would represent yet another chapter in a long pattern of upheld rulings. A result that does not fit the original prosecution's theory would immediately become the most significant development in this case since Peterson's original trial. We will continue following this story as the appeal moves through the higher court, as DNA results from that single piece of evidence are finalized, and as this case, more than 2 decades old, continues to test whether new science and renewed scrutiny can actually change a conviction once a jury and years of appellate courts have already spoken. We will bring you those developments the moment they are verified, and not before. That is everything we have for you on this update. If you want to see where this case goes next, and whether this new evidence actually holds up under further testing, make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss it. Drop a like if you found this breakdown genuinely useful, and let us know in the comments which side of this new evidence you find more convincing. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next one.